Hello, everyone.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hi, Musa. Let me ping some people here. Alex. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning.
Yeah, I
Could
know it's
we,
early.
could we make a rule maybe that we decide whether or not this meeting is necessary the day before, not at 5:30 in the morning?
Yeah, we could. I guess the other thing to do it because is that if nobody adds anything, right, then we just skip it. We can check the evening before. We
Well,
had
there's a list.
decided last. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that might be a good idea if nobody adds anything. But at the same time, I think there's also a backlog of things that we should talk about, I suppose. Um, like the interface stability and a bunch of other things that are architecturally related. But
Yeah.
um, but I don't know if we do that here or in the main TSC meeting. So that's one thing.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
you're right. I just don't. I feel a little bit like if when people want to talk about stuff, they'll add it. But I mean, I can add it as well and hope that the right people show up that have input. Uh, okay, we got Barath B, Barath K, Muthu, me, Shiva, and Alex. Awesome. Good. Uh, there was a request by Alex to try to determine if this meeting is happening or not the day before, and the reason for that is obviously him having to get up at 5:30 to find out that the meeting is canceled. Yes, and I get that, Alex. Uh, so we'll see if we can improve on that. Okay. Apart from that, I guess we're 4 minutes over, and we have a bunch of people here. Muthu, you wanted to talk about DRPC and a little bit of the composition. Which one do you want to start with? Because we have some. I guess Barath can say a little bit where we are on the HPE side of looking at DRPC.
Sorry, I was talking on mute. For composition service, we started our like groundworks, the designing the APIs and other stuff. But in the last week's meeting, Bharat was mentioning about using the GRPs for the the intercommunication between the processes. We would like to know more about it. This may be a kind of technical session. So that is the reason I asked for the meeting. Last week we discussed about if there are any other agenda today, we can block this slot for discussing on that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so Muthu, that's why Shiva has joined us today. He'll be showing us how to work with gRPC and even Redis DB if time permits. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Thank you, Bharat.
So just to catch up, the discussion last week was around use of gRPC within individual kind of service implementations, or in between, or both?
In between, right? I mean, the microservices currently they're using Go Micro, so the microservices can only be implemented using Go language. But AMI wanted to do this composition service in Python, so we anyway, because Go Micro was having an unfavorable license, so we wanted to migrate it anyway. So we thought
Yeah,
that
that makes sense. Yeah.
yeah.
So to that end, I just want to make sure I have the right background. So kind of two parts to the composition service, right? There's the northbound kind of facing part, maybe the front end, right? That sort of allows the composition APIs to be called and executed on by the composition service. And then there is the back end stuff, like the plugins, I would imagine, that need to go with different hardware and whatnot. Is that all going to be? Are we saying that okay? How do I put it? So the northbound API I would expect to be based on REST or on
Yes.
Redfish.
Yeah.
Yes.
And if other services want to call the composition service to accomplish something, would they now call the REST API, or would they call this other sideways east-west API?
The current thing is for east-west, which AMI wants. Services external to ODIM array will use a REST API.
Yeah, composition service, we are planning to add two different microservices. One is the API server, which is like exposing the composition service APIs in the northbound through the resource aggregator. Redfish V1 composition service is the root path. Then from there, resource blocks, resource zones, everything will be taken care by the composition service, the API server, which is purely Redfish-based RESTful APIs. On the other,
So we don't need to have a separate API service for composition. The current API service, can forward that to the composition service, right?
okay.
Yeah.
That part we need to understand.
Yeah.
So, and the other services like collecting data from the either database or talking to the other services to collect the resource information and build the resource blocks. That's a background service that takes care of building the resource blocks. Either it talks to the aggregation service itself through the API and collect the API and build the resource blocks, or it may talk to the other channels to the hardware or Redfish services to get the resource information and build the resource blocks. That is the idea. We would prefer to use the resource aggregators API itself internally, like as a client, get the resource aggregators resource APIs, ODIM's northbound APIs, and just build the resource blocks and resource zones based on the information.
Yeah, since the composition service will be running as another microservice within ODIM array,
Yeah.
I think we can use the RPC calls, which is already defined for the system service,
Yeah.
which is used to query this, right? So, and if you want any other service also, there will be RPC stubs already in place, so we don't have to go out and come back again into the.
Yeah. Basically, we need to understand that RPC mechanism, how the communication is happening, how we can make use of the steps. That is the reason I asked for
Yeah.
the meeting.
So we'll describe that today.
Yeah. Thank you, Bharat.
Yeah. Anything else from Alex or Muthu?
I don't have anything from my side.
Okay.
Other
So,
services like aggregation or whatnot, is the expectation that they also understand gRPC?
So yeah, Alex, what's happening currently is, as I said earlier, right, that they use Go Micro to communicate with each other. So we have the proto files, which are like the interface files anyway defined. So we can retarget, I mean, replace Go Micro with gRPC. So all the microservices can talk to each other using gRPC.
Yeah,
Well, what if the implementation is not microservice centric, which we have to be able to assume that if we ever reach a point where there are multiple companies working on code, and some of them have contributions that are not going to be in Go lang,
And that's
that
what, see, this composition service from AMI is going to be in Python language, and microservice is just like, current architecture. If somebody wants to plug in a bigger service, they can still use the RPC for gRPC for things like, session and management and authentication, authorization, and talking to the inventory via the system and all that.
and that will have to be, and that's going to be, those are going to be public interfaces that anyone who wants to implement an alternative composition service would have to also implement.
Yes. So the proto files, which are like the ideal files, we have to use the proto C tool, which is supplied by Google. So what it does is it has multiple compilers for different languages. So it'll translate and generate, like, use the proto files to generate stub functions in whatever language you desire.
Sure.
So like,
It's like
yeah,
Corba basically back in
yeah.
the day.
No, I guess what I'm saying is that typically you try to avoid east-west APIs and you run everything through an API gateway or an API management layer like Apigee.
Yeah, but Alex, the thing here is that this is inter-services communication. So
Oh,
when you
yeah,
say
because okay, so if let's say tomorrow another company wants to provide a composition service,
yeah, that should
now
be
they would have
fine.
to implement a whole bunch of other interfaces as opposed to simply implementing the DMTF APIs.
Well, the
Just
DMTF APIs is northbound, so you can get clients to talk to the composition service. But how do you create a task? Do you want to do that yourself, or do you want to reuse the ODIM task mechanism? That's where you can use this gRPC, right? Because
okay,
you
so
wanted to have this inter services communication
I just
module based. Yeah.
makes sense. Yeah, I just want to make sure we don't place on unnecessary burden on those that may want to implement
Yeah.
things and substitute them in.
And in fact, Alex, URP currently uses the northbound API to contact system and
Okay,
aggregate
so we're
service.
not
That will also be
precluding
possible. Yeah.
that from happening.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So, Jonas, do we take that we can start off, or is there anything else?
Sorry?
Do we start off on this?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, Shiva, can you please start?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, let me start sharing my screen. For ease, I'll just be using Visual Studio Code to just highlight a couple of things and to jump between the calls. So this is the same GitHub code that we have in place. So as you know, ODIM has like API service as the entry point. Right? So under
Shiva,
API
is this
service,
the main? Okay, yeah.
yeah, I'm just getting to it.
Yeah.
So let me just close all this. So yeah, if you see on the left hand side, this is our ODIM repo. So once we get on these are the contents that we get. So since ODIM is API based as an entry point, under SVC API, which is API service, main.go is the main entry point for the command flow. So under which we first define routers, and later we have some prereq for continued execution. So under routers, if we jump to it, we have certain structs defined for each of the service, and for each action, we have a certain RPC function that assigned to that. Say, for example, for explaining this communication between services and RPC, I'll be taking aggregation service as an example, under which I'll be taking reset as a scenario. So let's say here under aggregator RPCs, we have reset RPC key, for which we have assigned RPC.do reset request. I'm just highlighting it. I'll come back to this. So under the same router file, we have defined routes for each of the services, right? So for each URL, where should the flow go, and what should be done. So under aggregation service, for reset action, we are telling the flow to go to a certain handler. So for any usual standard API framework, we have routers and then handlers, models, and then subsequent things. So after routes, we go to handlers. So we go from that for this specific route, go to the specific handler. Under this handler, so if we jump to this, if you see on the top, I'm just highlighting it here. It will be under SSE API handlers, under aggregation file. We have a reset handler for which we basically do some prereq things for getting the session token that the user has passed, and then also getting the data that comes with the request, and do some basic validations here. And till here it will be basic validations, and then next step is to form a RPC request. So once we come to a handler in handlers for any service or any action in API service, from the handlers, the flow go to the RPC section. So from SVC API RPC, the flow will next go to that particular service RPC. So how the RPCs are defined is, so for this particular request in libutilities, we have a section called proto, under which for each of the service we have defined protofiles. So for aggregation service protocol, we have defined a set of RPC functions, one of which we are talking about right now is reset. So for the reset or any other function, we have to mention what parameters it takes and what parameters it returns. So we have to define those two here in the same file. So once that's been defined in the proto file, we have a proto command term which will auto generate. On the left hand side, we see there are two files, which is pb.go and micro.go. So these two files will be auto generated, and we don't have to edit any contents from this. So going forward, since we are moving from Go Micro to gRPC, this will be replaced.
So when these files will be auto-generated at the time of like compilation or in the runtime?
So Muthu, currently it's generated and kept in the repository.
Repository, okay.
Yeah, but because of Go Micro issues, we couldn't make it to generate every time we build. But I think once we go to gRPC, we will remove the generated files, and every time we build, it can generate. That's what we'll aim for.
Okay.
Yeah. But these are stub files, so we shouldn't be changing anything like at any time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in that one particular scenario that Muthu that you're talking about, when you have to add certain action.
Just a
Shiva,
quick question. The aggregator service, those are basically the Redfish APIs, right?
Yes.
So,
These ones you're saying.
So why
No,
not?
even the RPC is also.
Mhm.
So in essence, they become wrappers of the Redfish APIs.
Yes, Alex.
Okay, and we believe that's a good idea.
Are
Yeah,
you worried
that's.
that if we upgrade those APIs because there is a new release, we will have? Does that mean we have to generate new stub files and all this, or how would that affect things, guys?
Yeah, I mean, if things change in terms of API signatures or contracts, how would we handle that?
So if the method itself changes, then we add a new method. But if you see the request, right, it's fairly fixed. So if this changes again, we'll need to have another method which will see the version of the request and then use the appropriate RPC methods.
Yeah. Here, as per the mentioning, it's pretty minimal where we are sending session and token information, the request body and the URL, nothing specific to like a certain action. But so if at all, say for an aggregation service request, if a request body is not needed, then that becomes another step we can use here. Which
I would have
can be useful.
expected the reverse, right? I would have expected that the northbound interfaces, when invoked, would end up in some sort of API gateway that would then translate from Redfish external representation, right, which is all RESTful, to the gRPC way of looking at it. So I don't have to write. I mean, and I think Apogee allows you to actually do those mappings, if I'm not mistaken, but maybe I'm confusing it with something else. I guess my point is that we would be required to manage two API sets, the external one and the internal one. And if we want to be able to support a range of versions, now how would that work? Like, for example, no one's going to move their implementation of BMC or any other piece of software on a dime between version X, 2.1 of the spec and version 2.2, let's say. And so conceivably, we would need to be able to support both. And if that's the case and the API signatures change, what does that mean? I now have to implement multiple sets of wrappers and have multiple, in my own service. And now I'm responsible for handling the actual semantics in a different way as well. In order to, you see how much change we would incur in that case?
So I guess if we move from one Redfish version to another, there is obviously what we support and how many versions back we support. But there is backward compatibility with Redfish though. So even though an older client comes in, so Baras, if an older client comes in, do we know what that client is expecting, or does it matter because he's only going to use whatever he is looking for anyhow? I mean, how does that work?
General APIs, when the actual behavior changes, right, and there is actual deprecation, then
In the MTF?
no, I mean
But
generally I'm saying generally in
Generally.
REST.
deprecation doesn't happen overnight.
Yes, yes.
Deprecation typically means multiple releases where the interfaces of both sets, the new and the old interfaces, are supported. And so there are three use cases. There's the old API client and the new implementation. There's a new API client and an old implementation. And there is, exact match. The exact match I'm not concerned about. I just want to understand what the expectations are from a development perspective on a company that might want to contribute a service. And what does that mean in terms of handling versioning? If somebody external to me does it, I'm good to go. If I have to personally, meaning within my service, handle all of that, that would be just a hell of a lot of extra things to do.
Yeah, but see, that's what I was trying to come to. See, when you say general, like non-Redfish REST application, usually they'll handle it with the XAPI versioning. So the version, they'll have a XAPI version header. So then the application server will see which is the version and handle it appropriately. But what we've seen from the Redfish is that Redfish always adds, it never removes. And it's very like, doesn't remove any resource, definitely. Even actions, it adds to that. It doesn't remove that. So there are two things here. Like one is when you refer to say this set default port order, and there are I think one or two more methods which are actions, but all the others are just um, add, that is post, put, get operations on aggregation sources. So there is no real change in terms of behavior, but I mean, yeah, maybe some extra attributes get added up, but it never breaks the older version. So if somebody sends an older version request, still goes through, unless yeah, if you marry the even the profiles also, it will not tell much about the parameters and all stuff, right? It just talks about the operations. So the resources and their operations are always there.
So any given service would be required to implement these two sets of APIs. And maintain two different ways of providing access to its functionality. That's what we're really saying.
Yeah.
And this is for the sake of simplicity, because I could also argue that I mean, gRPC usually gets chosen when you want to have fast communication, right? Because it's faster than REST.
Yeah. See, but the
But
underlying behavior sort is governed by Redfish, not gRPC. No? So if even your apogee also, whatever you're talking about, we'll have to then worry about translating different versions of Redfish API calls and into corresponding RPC calls, gRPC calls, right?
yeah, I guess what I'm saying is I understand that we need to build a set of utility functions that enable kind of some common sort of capabilities across all services, like creating a task, keeping track of things, and eventing, things of that nature. For some of those, they're external APIs exposed to enable that to happen. For some, there may not be, right?
Yeah.
So I get the utility layer maybe requiring, an implementation private way of, or ODIM private way of doing the invocations.
So sorry, Alex, I missed for one thing. If you see the like after the message, where the current cursor is, right, the message has request body. So each of these requests that comes in from the user client, that will be like treated as a sequence of bytes, and RPC is just a transport. So the end person who is implementing they look into this request. So these are and perform accordingly. So this RPC actually never changes because of changes in the request bodies, which is of concern when the version is updated with new things, as you say, right? So when we unmarshal the bytes and get the JSON from that, then the handler there. So actually the Redfish specific code only will be doing the marshaling and acting upon the request. So this RPC need not have this versioning. This is what I feel. So we have the third thing in this is the URI, and then the session token is there for validating. So the URL is like resource URI, and then whatever operations or whatever is there, it's there in the request body. So RPC need not change for variations with this, unless we're adding a new action. So then but and whoever is consuming it will see that if say suppose it's having an older payload but using a newer URI, where the request whatever is there is not there, then the handler can always handle this, right?
But we are asking for new actions to be added, right? New verbs in Redfish APIs.
Yeah, sometimes we are.
Yes.
No, but this won't change, right? I mean, this
But I
is
mean,
still
if,
what?
so
No,
I want to poke at what Alex said there. So if we are asking for new action, we will obviously approach the MTF to get that into the spec, right? Is that what you mean, Alex? Or and then if they release a new version of the spec and we want to implement that, that action has to be implemented if we want to support it, right? Obviously, bear in mind that actions are not mandatory and very little is, of course, in Redfish.
Sorry, guys, I'm having trouble unmuting here. Yeah, I guess I just want to understand, from an implementation point of view, if we were to, produce a how-to guide for developers of different services or for contributions.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand how many layers of translation things will have to go through from a client to the back end. So if I have if I have a composer, I invoke REST, but then REST gets converted into gRPC. And then from gRPC, it goes to a REST implementation, which now has to support a gRPC as well. And if we're doing this to preserve language binding independence, well, that's what REST was supposed to do. And if it doesn't really matter how you implement you could write a shell script and still do REST calls.
Then what you're saying is we replace our gRPC with HTTPS.
Well, yeah, I mean, unless we're doing gRPC for another reason, I don't really.
It was just communication between microservices.
Well, but I mean, your microservices could use HTTP to talk. In fact, they should be abstract functions that hide the actual transport semantics and the data representation semantics. I would hope that our our microservices exchange messages, abstract messages, and how they delivered and how the content is handled is something that could be made, implementation specific. I'm worried. I mean, and you guys know this better than anybody, right? It's, AMI, well, any kind of BMC implementation, right, has constraints in terms of where it runs, in terms of memory, processor capacity, all sorts of other things, persistent storage. The simpler the implementation, the better off we're going to be. But here we're just sort of adding extra.
No, Alex, no. This doesn't ever communicate with the BMCs. See, what's going to happen is, say, when the API service, Redfish API service, talks to aggregation or system service, that's when we use gRPC. So in the aggregation service itself, has to talk to the device. It sends a request using HTTP to the plugin, and the plugin also uses HTTP only to talk to the device. Then they're not going to use gRPC for the device communication. In fact, even plugin communication doesn't use gRPC.
So
We use
you,
HTTPS only.
so you are saying like only the intercommunication between the ODIM services is using gRPC.
Yes.
For example,
Yes.
composition service need to consume some of the APIs from like a system service. So we need to use RPC there. The same way, the system service and the aggregation service will have to use the gRPC for their intercommunication. But northbound, everything is exposed as a RESTful API in the REDFI standards. The aggregation service
Yes.
exposes
Yes.
everything in the RESTful API for the clients. For client also, it is a like RESTful communication, not the
Yes.
gRPC communication.
Yes.
And
But
Client.
what's the difference between an external client and an internal client? And
Uh, External clients actually make, say, the service request, right? But internal clients say, like, if you are talking about API service, the first thing it'll do is say, like, validate the session ID. So see if that is a valid session, and that is not something which is given by Redfish, right? So the session will say whether it's a valid account, and I mean, assign a session ID, and then session service will see if the that session token is matching and all those things. So these are like infrastructure layer for getting the end-to-end service. And see, the API service will be the gateway. So it will route, say if it's the aggregation URI, then service URI, sends it to the aggregator microservice. If the system call, say like get and all that, get on values, or even do some operation post and all that, other than what is there in aggregation, he'll send it to the system microservice. That will use a HTTP service to among other things, because the plugin is stateless, it will take up the credentials and pass the request to the plugin. Plugin will use that credential in a HTTPS call, and the plugin also makes an HTTP or HTTPS call to the BMC, gets the operation done, sends back the response. So it's only the core microservices they talk to each other using this RPC.
yeah, I would just suggest that what the BMC implements and or how the implementation of some of these services is done is not necessarily limited. Um, um, I guess I can easily imagine an embedded version of ODIM inside the BMC, providing these aggregation capabilities for things that that BMC will manage. So I could imagine, say, a bunch of loosely coupled disaggregated infrastructure with a bunch of processing units that need to be aggregated into groups and maintained and dealt with. Plus, there may be other things I want to be able to do, and then I could also provide composition services to dynamically construct or resources. You know, and the BMC in essence becomes an implementation of ODIM.
Yeah, that's exactly what the aggregation service does, right? So we aggregate the thing based on aggregates. There is an aggregate also which is there in aggregator service, right? Aggregation service. So we can aggregate a group of services, and beyond that, when the aggregation service or the system service sends down to the plugin, it will check the plugin type for the device and send it to the appropriate device. Plugin itself. So you could run Dell, Intel, or any other plugin simultaneously for servers, and the requests are already routed as per that type. So we do match the the device type and where it's been registered with which plugin, and send that accordingly. And when you say this, see, like reset is something that takes aggregates a list of, I mean, aggregate ID as a aggregates ID as a parameter. So all the devices that are belonging to that particular aggregate are only reset. So that function is already there. And they all use HTTPS.
Let's keep going. I'm still not entirely sure I see the value of doing this if all we're really trying to do is enable interoperability between language bindings. But
No, see, it's not interoperable between language bindings only. Alex, like, see, this can equally be done with the HTTP thing, or it can also be done using the gRPC thing. Both help us overcome the language barrier, right? I mean, HTTP is even more simpler. One of
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
reasons,
it's fine. I guess what, I'm just, so like if we build a telemetry service at Intel, we would have to provide some stubs, I guess, with gRPC so that if somebody needed to call
yeah.
that telemetry service to put a system under management, for example, or under monitoring, we would need to expect stuff to come over two pipes instead of one pipe.
So actually, there is another thing that, one of the things we did discuss when we did this is that, why have this so many methods at all? Like if it's just an RPC endpoint, then what we can do is just have one method, right? Which just takes, anyway, that's what it does now also, seemingly. That is, take the session token, take the request body and the URL as part of the request and send it across. But some method, there were some differences in the responses types and all that, and how it needed to be handled. So if your concern is having to redefine these protofiles every time, that's another thing we can try is, instead of having these many methods, we just, in fact, we don't even need to have all this, um, you know, protofiles at all. We just have one protofile which says like, invoke operation or anything, some generic name like that, packs the aggregator request and brings back the aggregation response. But one of the things that happens with that is that when you have a single method, then the complexity of the handlers and the requester, say, who is translating a redfish call to an RPC, that and handling the responses back, that becomes more complicated.
There's complexity either way. I would
Yeah.
agree that, having a generic do what I mean invocation is not going to be very efficient, right? So
Yeah.
let's not even worry about that. I guess I was hoping that, the guidance we would give service developers is that they need to be able to implement a backend that, contain, basically realizes semantics of a given, redfish service. And they will expect, the HTTP request body, and they will be using JSON and the usual stuff. And everything else we need to do to front that with a gRPC call or whatever, that would be something that they don't have to maintain.
Yeah, so all that you do as mentioning is handled, but the only problem is that we've had different functions to do that, the RPC functions. Because if you see the request, that's the same request body message type that we've defined.
Yeah, so
And
that's fine. Yeah, I understand that we're not mangling in any way the actual request body, right? They remain
yeah.
consistent with the schema, and everything is okay. And so just
For,
again trying, yeah.
yeah, for composition service, our original idea was to for the intercommunication, we were planned to use the like RP, like the REST APIs itself, like system collection. I can get it. I can be a like internal client and talk to aggregation service and get the system collection and process it and build the resource blocks, and then I can expose the resource blocks through resource aggregator. That's what was our earlier plan. Since this is like
So, but then in that case, Muthu, what happens is like every time you need to make a call to say aggregation service, you need to go out to the Nginx outside of ODIM, then come down back.
Yeah, that problem is
What
there.
do you mean go outside of ODIM? You don't have to. You can connect maybe on different ports depending on whether or not you do internal requests or external, but no one says you have to go to the outside.
Well, I mean, you have to have appropriate instance, so you have to hit the load balancer, right? Or
Yeah, and so you have a private, point of invocation in the public. All it basically means is that you're giving somebody two different IP addresses, two different port numbers. That's it.
So here it will be the service name, Jonas. But then,
yeah.
like again, it still needs to go out and come back. It's just that, whether we do it from the Nginx level or maybe what Alex is saying is that without going out of Kubernetes, we'll have to send it to the API service, which will then distribute again to the various services.
Yeah, kind of what I'm saying is that if you have an API gateway, it can accept requests coming on different ports, right, from different places.
Yeah, but that will not work for all the calls. Like say if you're trying to get the session stuff going and all right, validation.
Well, whatever's external has to be accessible for the rest, no matter what. Whatever is internal to ODIM, right? ODIM private can be implemented whichever way we want to. So if we define a utility library that basically expects a bunch of gRPC calls, that's fine because it's a utility library.
So,
right? But again, I'm just trying to still understand why anybody would want to implement two different ways of invoking a particular service.
but Bharath, so if, for instance, let's say we have a composition service and we wanted to return a task, what would be the RPC way of doing that? Because there is no external interface.
Yeah. For that, we need to use the task itself, the RPC itself. We cannot use a REST one because
REST API.
yeah.
So I cannot make a post to the task service or something like that.
No, you cannot. You can only do a get to ensure that your task is completed or what's the status. You cannot create or delete tasks from the external API.
Yeah, there is no task service. Tasks are a response to something that takes too long, right?
Yeah.
So, but I think for that it's a given, right? That we need to do gRPC, and then what Alex is saying, I guess, is for APIs that are anyhow external, why can't we go out and just use REST? But I just coming from another proprietary product back in the days that happens to be a management product in HPE, where they have external APIs and then they have REST between all services. But by the end of the day, there were libraries created to be able to communicate between the services without doing actual REST calls. The REST calls were handled by the libraries, and the reason was it was so easy. It's much easier to just interact and create new code that way.
That's kind of what I was suggesting.
That would have been easier because it's not a microservice architecture, right?
Yeah. Well, it was
what's a microservice? It's a bundle of code that runs, right? That sits inside, a side, with a sidecar on the side and a service mesh in the front. It's a piece of software. And if that piece of software is written in C++, I could still issue, call on some client-side library and do what I need to get done using simple HTTP.
Yeah, but that call better be a standard interface. We can't have internal functions exposed that way, right?
Yeah, no, that is true.
Yeah.
But how did you do it with Go Micro? Did Go Micro also exercise the REST APIs? Or?
No. Go Micro uses this proto itself.
So why are we? So is this like the RPC, the gRPC exercising these REST APIs that are anyhow available externally. Is that a new thing now, or was it always there? I mean, I'm trying to understand.
I didn't get what you say.
So before we had introduced gRPC, we had Go Micro, right? And
Yeah, whatever we're discussing here is Go Micro itself. We have not implemented gRPC yet, right? We started on it, but it's
okay.
not here. Yeah.
So Go Micro itself was also under the hood exercising REST calls to our external REST APIs.
External and internal, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so we need to make a distinction, right? And that's for sure. There's ODIM public APIs and ODIM private APIs. ODIM private APIs can have any kinds of language bindings we decide on, and they could be just a single language binding. And you know, we can decide on how to version those and you know what it means in terms of stability levels and all that. External APIs were tied to Redfish. And when I say external, I mean north and southbound. So there we don't have much leeway. And for those kinds of services that implement, you know, those you know API facades, I guess northbound and southbound, they shouldn't have to worry, you know, that they have to be implemented in Go or in Python or in anything else. They could be implemented in whatever you want. All they need to do is be able to accept.
But you get that with gRPC as well, right? You just get the stuff.
But that's my point, right? So now, so why do I need to have two ways to do this instead of just one, and limit the use of gRPC to internal functions that are not exposed externally? That's the part I don't get.
Yeah, I don't know. It could be that it's easier to program in gRPC than it is to set up a REST client for everything you want to do. I don't know. Barbara, do you have any thoughts? That's what I ran into.
Not exactly that, but there are the other challenges like, you know, say if you are having internal calls, then how do you authenticate that? That will become asymmetric, right? For externals, we'll have the session ID, and then for the internal, do we use the same session ID or?
Well, it's meant to be trustworthy, right? I mean, like
Yeah.
there's a trust domain there that you expect to be preserved and protected on the boundaries. I mean, you're talking about calling a utility function to create a long living callback, a task. Does that really require?
We use session ID, yeah.
The Nginx service, right? Resource like aggregator, like ODIM RA that is using Nginx, right? So internally, are you guys using any like reverse proxy to the system service or anything, or it is tightly bound to the Nginx itself?
I didn't
The
get
northbound, it is northbound. The ODIM RA exposes everything. That's a Nginx service, right?
Yeah, Nginx accepts that and distributes load between the multiple instances nodes, and then that is you know, the API server internally, not the what do you call Kubernetes API, is the ODIM API service that
the ODIM the ODIM API server is runs on a local host and a different port, and Nginx is like doing the reverse proxy to that one, or
yes.
Then in that case, the composition service can directly call the like ODIM APIs, right? Since it is running on the local host instead of coming through the Nginx. That's what I think Alex is trying to.
Yes.
Yeah, but that's so that is for the APIs that are exposed to northbound, right?
Or southbound.
Yeah, API exposed to northbound, but internal. Maybe you listen on only local host and redirect to Nginx. Nginx will expose the port to the outside world as a public APIs. So any outside communication to the ODIM should come from the northbound, like that port. What is that port? 8443 or some other 13,000 or whatever the port number. But internally, our system services and other like task services, everything is exposing some like local ports, right? Different port, and that is
Yes.
redirect. That port was consumed by the Nginx service as a reverse proxy. So since ODIM service, it's a composition service is also sitting on the same layer internally, composition service can make use of the local port communicate, local host colon 13,001 or 13,002, something like that. They can make use
That's
of
for
it.
the API service you're
Yeah,
talking
for
about,
the
right?
API. So
Yeah,
basically,
if you're looking, for example, how Netflix does this, right? They have an external gateway and an internal gateway, and the internal gateway assumes a different degree of trust and authentication requirements than the external one. So
since such a model, we no need to like the external like additional microservices will always communicate through like RESTful, so that it is like implementation wise and maintenance wise, it's kind of better, I feel. It's just my suggestion here.
Yeah, but I don't see a problem with. See, the thing is this, right? While I do agree with Alex to some, I mean the observation he did here and raising the concern is very valid. That okay, so we are anyhow using external REST API, so why do we wrap that in RPC? I do not see a big issue with it though. If you want to do it to simplify coding and stuff, the only thing is that you need to take care of upgrading that part as soon as we move to a new version, right? If the external APIs are changed in a way that would benefit us, we would obviously need to go into these gRPC calls and make sure that we adhere to the latest
but I think
APIs then, right? And that is an extra step. So that's,
Yeah,
I
and
guess, the point.
even when we need to upgrade these APIs, even if we use HTTPS or HTTP, then even then we have to do that
Even then you have to
adaptation.
do it because this is just an abstraction layer. So
Yeah.
if you don't do it there, you have to do it in your REST implementation that you use to exercise those APIs. So that's also a good point, Bharat. I agree.
I would say that the ease of implementation is orthogonal to what we're talking about to some extent, right? Again, we should be, one of the things we've talked about is being able to embed ODIM, whether it be embedded inside racks or top of rack switches or inside the BMC or other management controllers. There's a possibility that it will be embedded. If it is, then whatever APIs that embedded thing will expose could be a combination of BMC and higher order services as well. Or it could be something completely different, right? The only thing that matters in all this is that the APIs are consistent and the APIs that are public are well known and have well known semantics that don't change and all the time, right? So that's why we need versioning and all that. The internals.
Hi guys, did I lose all of you or just Alex?
No, I think Alex.
Alex,
Yeah, I just don't know internally. I'm still not convinced that we need to be able to translate between two almost the way we're using gRPC versus REST. They just seem to be very similar reasons, right? And so why do we need two if one can do the job?
But they're already there, right? So the question is, do we want to take a pause and remove all of this at this point? And they are also, I mean, like Bharat is pointing out, that the work that you have to put in to upgrade from one version to another will not disappear just because you tear these gRPC wrappers out, because then whatever you did to exercise those APIs will also need to be upgraded, right? Let's say if I don't want to use gRPC, like for instance, if AMI is now here saying, yeah, we're going to use the gRPC for all the internal calls within ODIM, like if we need a new task and stuff. Any call that doesn't have a northbound REST API, we are going to use gRPC. The rest, we are just going to use REST calls to the external APIs. Yes, AMI can do that. And then whenever we upgrade the external APIs, AMI will have to take care of to go and change all that, right? instead of we're changing it in one place, and that is the gRPC wrapper code. So it's two ways of looking at it, right? You want to get rid of complexity, but in the end, how much work do we need to put in, right? That's the other angle you can put forward here, I guess. Because you could have multiple services that come in later here, and they all exercise northbound APIs, and they all have their own implementation of getting to those APIs, and they all have to change the day we upgrade the APIs. Or you can have that code in one place under the gRPC umbrella, and you just go and make the change there. Did I lose you guys, or am I completely?
No, you're making
Jonas.
sense. I mean, obviously, but you know, again, if the common currency, the common language that we're expected to provide is based on HTTP REST, then gRPC seems to be
that is
the
another
overhead.
topic, though, and I don't want to really get into that here. But we had a question from multiple directions that should we in the future support some northbound gRPC protocol with just REST, the Redfish model embedded, like in JSON. That is something that Google went and knocked on the MTF's door and asked about that.
And didn't get anywhere.
They didn't get anywhere because they came in with a certain level of arrogance, if you ask me. But there are also other customers, specifically when you talk about things like telemetry, it becomes really difficult to just use what is pushed forward by the MTF today with these posts and WebSocket streaming. A protocol like gRPC is much better suited for sending out.
Yeah, but then you're talking about non-DMTF compliant APIs.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. So we wouldn't stand that up necessarily, but we would perhaps entertain a discussion with the MTF. So I'm saying,
So here's how I look at it, right?
Yeah.
From a community perspective, we need to focus on things that we have to do in common, right? There's a set of REST APIs, there's a set of northbound and southbound REST APIs. What happens internally within the ODIM, we can have a reference implementation for what that looks like, but as much as possible, we should reserve the freedom of implementation of individual services for different potential contributors. I know it doesn't seem like much of an issue today because let's face it, it's really just 3 companies doing the work. But if we ever want to get to a point where we're truly sort of industry viable, it's going to have to be more than 3. And so once you have more and more companies, the diversity of language bindings is going to come into play. I guarantee it. And so then the only thing you worry about is that you have, if you want to isolate a bunch of code into utility libraries that create tasks and then keep track of them and then, handle the callbacks and all that, that's all great. And we can decide, what those interfaces should look like. And as long as they're language binding agnostic, well, we're good. Okay, that's the internal sort of set of functions that you may want to consume, but everything else is always going to be in REST if we're going to claim compatibility with a standard. If some commercial implementation wants to expose those private APIs or translate the REST into gRPC, they're free to do so. Right, and at least then we can say it's partial. Maybe partial DMTF compatibility because the schemas of the request bodies would still be compliant with the spec, but not the API invocations. That's how I would do it.
Yeah, Alex, so what will not happen here, I can tell you, is that, so we can talk about long-term and these type of things, right? But we won't just put a break and tear all the Go microcode up that has to do with anything external REST interface at this point, because there's a lot of features that we're trying to get in, and obviously the composition service is key to that. So I think to having AMI taking the decision themselves, do we want to use gRPC code for external REST calls, or do we not? Is a sensible approach, I think. And then we can talk about long term what we want to do. If we want to get rid of any gRPC stuff that has to do with external REST interfaces, so be it. But it's not something we can just pause everything and tear it out. That's going to be difficult.
I'm not suggesting we tear anything out. There's always going to be legacy. What I'm trying to get to is a simple modular way of getting things done that doesn't require multiple protocol bindings, right? It's different than language independence. I guess I kind of was hoping we could end up with something that gave the actual developer contributors the flexibility of choosing their own language implementation.
Yeah,
And
that's
then
what we have now. They can either go straight to REST, and there's so many languages that support REST, or they can use gRPC. They need to use gRPC for some internal calls anyhow, and then they can do both in parallel. So I think there's a lot of flexibility there, right? For the developers, is it architectural sane? I think you can come up with arguments on both sides, and that's what I'm trying to do here. I hear what you were saying, but I also feel that if you have this translation and abstraction in one place, every time you upgrade, you have work in one place rather than all over the place. That is also a good argument. So it's just, you know, I think we can continue to discuss this, and it shouldn't necessarily put a stop on what AMI is doing, but long term we can talk about what we want to accomplish.
Well, I don't think I agree with you there, right? Because again, in my mind, if you're going to grow a successful community, how you do the implementation is really left as an exercise to the contributors. So the only thing I really care about are the API facades on different functions that might be implemented in different ways. And as long as those are well-known APIs and well-known definitions, then life is good.
Yeah. No, so let's have this discussion more. And I have to, as you might have anyhow concluded, Alex. I'm not necessarily. I wasn't aware of what Go Micro did under the hood. So some of this is news to me as well. But I do think we need to have the discussion a bit more. But is it clear to AMI though? I mean, we took a lot of time to discuss this, and now we're actually out of time. I'm probably late to our meeting. Is it clear to you guys how to continue here, or should we perhaps we could continue next week or?
We will continue
Well,
with this.
tomorrow.
This one, maybe tomorrow we can briefly discuss about it. And I have two more inputs. Sorry for the delay. It's getting late. We didn't get any input from feedback from DMTF based on for the query we have raised in the feedback.
Yeah, I did raise that with Jeff Hilland, and he has not come back to me yet. So hopefully, if I don't hear from him, I'll ping him again and see what's going on. I mean, you file something, you don't get an email back, so you're not really aware of if anybody got it. That's not good. So that's what we need to.
Yeah. The second thing is like we need to have a project created in the ODIM GitHub for composition service. I just logged in and I do not have permission to create a project.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
Yeah.
I think I might. So let me see. If you send to me, what do you want to call it? Just composition service?
Yeah. Composition services. Composition - service or whatever. Any name is fine. So I also need to know where, whether it is created on the root level or under ODIM. Under ODIM, it's all like the resource aggregator, everything, right? So
yeah, but there you would instead create a branch. But I think because you're doing this in another language, I think you would run it as a separate project.
Separate project.
Thinking.
Yeah, that's what
I suggest something in addition to composition service. Because say, as Alex says, someone else wants to have their own composition, right? Then there will be a clash. So maybe a different.
You think
what we want to do is decouple the API implementation from the realization of a service. That's what we want to do, right? Because that'll allow us to preserve the API semantics and deal with them once, and then how different versions of a call or different request bodies are handled, that could be specific to a particular use case. But that way, at least we could allow multiple implementations of a given service to either coexist or be substitutable.
Yeah. We really have to jump with 10 minutes
Yeah.
after. Sorry, guys. I appreciate the discussions today, though. Pretty good.
Yep. Bye.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's it from my side. Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.